Officer Johnson thought he had caught a criminal, a suspicious black man, all alone in Yellowstone National Park. It had to be trouble. But what he didn't know, when the truth came out in court, the entire courtroom was left in shock. Yellowstone National Park, one of the most breathtaking places in America. Mountains touching the sky, rivers flowing peacefully, and wildlife roaming free. A place where anyone can come to escape the chaos of life. But for Marcus Evans, this escape turned into a nightmare. He had planned this trip for weeks, a solo journey to disconnect from politics and reconnect with nature. No security, no assistance, just him and the wilderness. He parked his car near a scenic trail, grabbed his camera, and stepped out, breathing in the crisp morning air. A few minutes into his walk, the peace was shattered. The crunch of footsteps behind him. The distant crackle of a police radio. Then, a voice, sharp and demanding. "Sir, stop right there." Marcus turned around, surprised to see a park ranger, hand hovering over his holster. His heart pounded. He had done nothing wrong. The officer eyed him suspiciously. "What are you doing here?" Marcus frowned. "Taking pictures." But his answer didn't seem to satisfy the officer. The tension thickened as more questions followed, his tone growing harsher. Marcus knew exactly what was happening. He wasn't being treated as a visitor. He was being treated as a threat. A simple morning in nature had turned into an interrogation. And soon, it would get much worse. Marcus Evans, the mayor of Jackson City, had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. No politics, no meetings, just a chance to clear his mind in the vast beauty of Yellowstone National Park. He parked near a quiet trail, grabbed his camera, and set off to explore. The air was crisp, the sun was shining, and for the first time in months, he felt free. But that feeling didn't last long. A few minutes into his walk, the sound of tires crunching over gravel caught his attention. A park ranger's SUV pulled up, red and blue lights flashing. Marcus turned, confused, as the driver's side door swung open. "Sir, hands where I can see them," the officer ordered. His voice was firm, his posture rigid. Marcus froze. His instincts told him to stay calm. He raised his hand slightly and took a step back. "Is something wrong?" The officer, whose name tag read Johnson, narrowed his eyes. "What are you doing here?" Marcus frowned. "Walking. Taking pictures." Johnson's hand hovered over his holster. "Do you have ID?" Marcus nodded, carefully reaching for his wallet. He moved slowly, aware of the tension in the air. He pulled out his driver's license and handed it over. Johnson barely glanced at it before reaching for his radio. "Dispatch, I need a background check. Possible match for a suspect," Johnson muttered into the receiver. Marcus' stomach tightened. A suspect? He forced himself to stay composed. "What suspect?" Johnson didn't answer. He kept his eyes locked on Marcus, sizing him up. Minutes passed. Another ranger arrived. Then another. Tourists slowed down, some whispering, others watching from a distance. Marcus could feel their eyes on him, could hear the murmurs. "Step over here," Johnson ordered. Marcus' patience was wearing thin. "I've done nothing wrong. You already have my ID. Call my office if you need confirmation of who I am." Johnson let out a dry chuckle. "Your office?" His voice was laced with doubt. "And what do you do?" Marcus met his gaze. "I'm the mayor of Jackson City." Silence. Then, a smirk. Johnson shook his head. "Yeah, sure. Turn around." Before Marcus could protest, Johnson grabbed his arm and forced it behind his back. The cold steel of handcuffs snapped around his wrists. Tourists gasped. Someone started recording. Marcus' heart pounded. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was something else. Marcus stood still, his wrists locked in cold steel, his breath steady but controlled. Around him, whispers turned into murmurs, murmurs into gasps. A few tourists had their phones out, recording every second. He could feel their eyes, filled with curiosity, confusion, maybe even sympathy. But sympathy wouldn't set him free. Johnson tightened his grip on Marcus' arm and guided him toward the patrol car. "You're being detained for further questioning." Marcus glanced at him. "On what grounds?" Johnson didn't answer. He just shoved Marcus into the back seat and slammed the door shut. Inside the vehicle, Marcus clenched his jaw. This isn't about suspicion. This is about control. The radio crackled. A dispatcher's voice came through. "No active warrants. No criminal record." Johnson didn't acknowledge it. Instead, he leaned into the car, his voice low. "Why are you really here?" Marcus exhaled. "I told you I'm visiting. You ran my name and am clean. Now take off these cuffs." Johnson smirked. "Well, see what the station has to say about that." The SUV pulled away from the scenic trail, leaving behind a crowd of stunned onlookers. Marcus kept his gaze on the passing trees, his mind racing. He had been in tense situations before, debates, press conferences, political battles, but nothing like this. This wasn't just about power. This was about something deeper. At the station, the process was humiliating. Johnson and two other officers led Marcus inside. His belongings were taken, his fingerprints scanned. He was placed in a holding cell. No explanation, no phone call. Hours passed. The walls seemed to close in. Finally, a new voice. Firm, authoritative. "Get him out of there." Marcus turned. A senior officer stood at the entrance, arms crossed, an expression of disbelief on his face. "Do you have any idea who you just arrested?" Johnson frowned. "Some guy causing trouble in the park." The officer sighed, rubbing his temples. "That guy is the mayor of Jackson City." Johnson's face paled. Marcus stepped forward as the officer unlocked his cuffs. He flexed his wrists, looking Johnson in the eye. The senior officer shook his head. "You messed up." Marcus straightened his shoulders. His patience was gone. His voice was calm, but firm. "I want my lawyer, and I want an explanation." Johnson swallowed hard. He had made a mistake, one that would soon become national news. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back, cameras rolling. The tension in the air was thick. Everyone was waiting to hear how a mayor ended up in handcuffs over nothing. Marcus Evans sat at the defendant's table, composed but firm. His lawyer stood beside him, flipping through documents. Across from them, Officer Johnson shifted in his seat, his face pale. This wasn't how he thought things would turn out. The judge entered, adjusting his glasses as he reviewed the file in front of him. Then, he looked up. "Officer Johnson, let's get straight to it. On what basis did you arrest Mr. Evans?" Johnson cleared his throat. "He matched the description of a suspect, Your Honor." The judge raised an eyebrow. "And what exactly was that description?" Johnson hesitated. The courtroom waited. Black male. Alone. In the park. A murmur rippled through the room. Marcus' lawyer scoffed. "So, being black and alone is now probable cause for arrest?" Johnson's jaw tightened. He was acting suspicious. The judge leaned forward. "According to your own report, Mr. Evans was taking photographs. That's what tourists do at a national park. What part of that was suspicious?" Silence. Johnson's fingers gripped the table. The judge shook his head, flipping through the case file. No prior record. No outstanding warrants. A well-respected public official. Yet, he was detained, handcuffed, and placed in a holding cell without ever being informed of a charge. Marcus' lawyer stood. "Your Honor, my client wasn't arrested because he was a suspect. He was arrested because of racial profiling. If this were any other visitor, this wouldn't have happened." The judge turned to Johnson. "You were informed of his identity at the station, yet he was still treated like a criminal. Care to explain why? Johnson shifted uncomfortably. I didn't believe him at first. The courtroom erupted in whispers. The judge let out a sigh. Officer, it's one thing to make a mistake. It's another to double down on it. He turned to Marcus. Mr. Evans, you are free to go. This case is dismissed. Marcus exhaled slowly, but his mind was already elsewhere. The damage was done. Then, the judge looked back at Johnson. As for you, Officer Johnson, expect an internal review. I suggest you prepare yourself. Johnson swallowed hard. He had been so sure of himself. But now, with the entire country watching, he realized his actions had consequences. As Marcus stepped out of the courtroom, flashes from reporters' cameras lit up his face. Microphones were shoved toward him, voices overlapping. Mr. Evans, how do you feel about today's ruling? Will you be taking legal action against the officer? Do you think this was a case of racial profiling? Marcus paused, his expression calm but firm. I think the facts speak for themselves. He didn't say more. He didn't need to. The video of his arrest had already gone viral. The world had seen how easily a black man, even a mayor, could be treated like a criminal for doing nothing. Meanwhile, inside the police department, Officer Johnson sat in a stiff chair, waiting. His hands were clasped together, his foot tapping anxiously. A senior officer entered, dropping a file on the desk. This doesn't look good, the officer said, flipping through pages. The department is under fire, and you're at the center of it. Johnson swallowed hard. It was a mistake. No, the officer cut him off. It was your mistake. He sighed, rubbing his forehead. An internal investigation has already begun. Expect consequences. Johnson leaned back, his face pale. His confidence, his authority, it was all slipping away. As days passed, the video continued to circulate, sparking outrage. Protests erupted outside the station, demanding accountability. The public wanted more than just an apology. They wanted change. Marcus, however, wasn't looking for revenge. He wanted justice, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been judged before being heard. A week after the court ruling, Marcus Evans stood at a press conference, facing a sea of cameras and reporters. His voice was steady, his message clear. This isn't just about me, he said. It's about a system that assumes guilt before innocence. A system that needs to change. The video of his arrest had ignited national conversations. Social media was flooded with debates on racial profiling, police accountability, and the everyday struggles Black Americans faced. Protests continued outside the police department, demanding reform. As for Officer Johnson, the consequences were unavoidable. Following the internal investigation, he was suspended without pay. The department issued a public statement, acknowledging the wrongful arrest and vowing to improve training on racial bias. But for many, it wasn't enough. Marcus, however, wasn't focused on one officer's punishment. He had a bigger goal. He pushed for policies that would prevent situations like his from happening again. Better training, stricter protocols, and accountability for officers who abuse their power. He hadn't planned for his trip to Yellowstone to become a national incident. But now, he was determined to turn his humiliation into change. Because next time, the victim might not be a mayor. Racial profiling isn't just an inconvenience, it's a violation of basic human rights. If a respected mayor can be treated like a criminal for simply existing in the wrong place, what happens to those without power or influence? Justice shouldn't depend on status. It's time to question the system and demand real change before another innocent life is targeted. Racism is still real. The question is, what are we doing about it? Subscribe for more stories like this. Please note, this is not a real story, it's a work of fiction only for education and entertainment purposes.